Up next, a conversation on President-elect Donald Trump's relationship with the U.S. intelligence community. We'll hear from security and intelligence officials who talk about surveillance and privacy challenges. The Cato Institute hosted.
Good morning, and welcome to the Cato Institute, and welcome virtually to all of you watching at home to the 2016 Cato Institute Surveillance Conference, something of a now annual tradition, a day-long event where we explore a full array of the diverse legal, policy, and technological issues surrounding government surveillance for both law enforcement and intelligence purposes. 2016 is, I think, a case in point of the possibly apocryphal Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. For better or worse, the Obama administration has shown us 8 years of perhaps surprising continuity with its predecessor. That is, civil libertarians can look back on the last 8 years and count some victories in the war to protect privacy. We can look back on the first real diminution or contraction of the post 9/11 expansion of intelligence surveillance in the form of the USA Freedom Act and Presidential Policy Directive 28, an executive order constraining somewhat the ability of the intelligence community to collect in mass information about persons abroad. And now, at the same time, an entrenchment of really the Bush-era approach to the war on terror. So those who, listening to candidate Obama, pledged that, for example, in an Obama administration, there would be no more national security letters used to gather information about people not suspected of any wrongdoing, were perhaps disappointed, but neither did the expansion of that surveillance continue entirely unabated. We began to see the wave break and roll back. Now, the only thing we can really be sure of is that we cannot expect continuity. We have a rather extraordinary year, and like so many other things in 2016, it's essentially impossible to talk about this topic without talking about Donald Trump. Someone who really comes to the highest executive office in the land without a very clear sense of what his platform on a whole range of issues outside his core concerns looks like, but who has already created a great deal of anxiety, both in the intelligence community itself, by his sort of demonstrable distrust in that community, and at the same time among civil libertarians. He has demonstrated the kind of character that seems disposed to hold grudges and pursue slights, a kind of Nixonian instinct for enemies lists, and in particular for using private information to punish political enemies. And at the same time, someone with a seemingly very broad idea of the powers of the presidency without any kind of clear sign of a regard for the constitutional limitations on the powers of that office. And so, again, as it seems to be inevitable in 2016, we need to begin a discussion of these important policy issues by asking what the next 4 to 8 years look like under a Trump administration. What is the shape of the national security state, the deep state, the intelligence state under Donald Trump? Why have so many national security and intelligence officials regarded his ascendance to the White House with something approaching panic? And to discuss that, we've assembled, I think, a really excellent panel of veterans of the intelligence and national security communities. And to introduce that panel, we have one of the best national security reporters working today. We have Shane Harris of the Wall Street Journal, who is the author of an excellent book called The Watchers, and more recently, an also excellent book called At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. I cannot think of a better person or a better panel to kick off the 2016 Cato Surveillance Conference with an analysis of intelligence under the Trump administration. And I'll welcome our first panel to the stage. Thank you all.
Okay? Yeah? Good? Speak up. All right, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Julian, for the nice introduction, and to Cato for hosting us. I'm Shane Harris with the Wall Street Journal. The title of our panel today is Intelligence Under the Trump Administration, and as I was getting ready for this, I thought, if only we had a more interesting topic to kick things off. Yeah, so I am going to dispense with lengthy introductions so we can get started, but obviously I'm just going to introduce everyone here. Matt Olson, here on the left, who was, among other things, director of the National Counterterrorism Center and general counsel at the NSA. Carrie Cordero, who here to my left, who has been counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, among other things. Tim Edgar, who was the first Director of Civil Liberties and Privacy for the National Security Staff in the White House, and Susan Hennessy, formerly the NSA General Counsel's Office, and now the Managing Editor of Lawfare, which, if you're not reading, I hope you will be. So clearly the past 5 days have seen some extraordinary developments. If you're here at a Cato conference on surveillance, I probably don't need to remind you what happened Friday night with the Washington Post story coming out, but just to kind of recap and set the stage a little bit for a discussion about intelligence in the coming Trump administration. Obviously, it was reported that the CIA briefed to some senators that there was a little bit of a tweak on an earlier assessment that they had made that Russia had indeed directed hacks against the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign and some other political organizations for the purpose of interfering with U.S. elections, which was the unanimous conclusion that intelligence agencies came to in October. Now the CIA says, yes, and we think it was done in order to boost Donald Trump's chances of winning and to diminish Hillary Clinton's campaign. It has obviously since come out that there's a little bit of daylight between the CIA's position and the FBI and the Director of National Intelligence, which are not necessarily too sure that they share that view. But almost immediately after that story came out on Friday, Donald Trump, as is his wont, put out a statement saying that of the CIA, essentially, don't believe them. These are the same people who got it wrong about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction. It didn't take long for intelligence officials to start firing back with their own statements. And I think it's fair to say that what we have now is I think probably unprecedented, at the very least extraordinary, a rupture between the president-elect and the intelligence community that he is about to be directing, and that is there to serve him and his policy interests and goals and the people in his administration. So that's new and very interesting. And I want to get the discussion going with sort of talking about that extraordinary development. And I want to turn first to Susan and say, just a bit of a reaction. I mean, you've been in the intelligence community. You are now out of it. You follow these issues very closely. Kind of what you're seeing in this initial sort of, these salvos going back and forth. And we'll talk about this with everyone, but also what this is like for somebody inside the intelligence community, you think, watching this extraordinary drama play out.
Right, so I think the first thing that's sort of important to understand is the intelligence community is having very marginal disagreements about whether or not there is sufficient evidence to say that there was a particular motive. There's broad, unanimous agreement that there was Russian interference, that interference did in fact at least assist Donald Trump or inure to his benefit, even if it didn't change the outcome of the election necessarily. The second thing that I think it's sort of important for context is to understand that we shouldn't want a president to take intelligence as gospel, right? Any intelligence that comes up, that is the fact. It's actually a positive thing to have presidents and president-elects that have a little bit of skepticism, right? The intelligence community is not infallible. That said, Donald Trump's statements are really incredibly extraordinary and really consequential. One, he is outright rejecting, without providing any kind of evidence or reason for why, those unanimous assessments, right? He's not just saying that he doesn't believe it was Russia. He's saying maybe it's China. Maybe it's some guy on a bed, right? I mean, he really is sort of just refusing to even acknowledge that this might be true. And then second, he's actually accusing the intelligence community of being political or partisan. And that is a really, really consequential statement for a president to make. The intelligence community obviously engages in some controversial action. Sometimes they get things right, sometimes they get things wrong. They are not a political body. They do not do things for political purposes. They do things for the purposes of, so that senior leadership of the United States can make decisions based on facts. And so that's the area in which I think it becomes very, very challenging for someone serving in the intelligence community to say, they're really being accused by their boss of violating one of the most important fundamental tenets of intelligence, which is your duty is to the mission and to your country and not to a political party.
Matt, let me turn to you. I mean, as someone who has obviously briefed senior policymakers, I presume has briefed the president before, what's that first meeting like with the President Donald Trump, where he sits down with his, people even from the career ranks, let's say, people who he doesn't know, people who he's openly questioned the accuracy of their analysis, their intent, as Susan has laid out. What's that first meeting like, and then how does that begin to set the tone for a relationship?
Well, I would agree with what Susan said. I mean, and take it maybe even further in terms of the intelligence community not being political and how important that is to the community at large. I mean, in fact, it's probably the single most significant norm among intelligence officials is that their efforts, their intelligence collection, and their analysis is not informed by anything other than their effort to discern the truth. Again, not infallible, and I think it's right for the president and other policymakers to question the intelligence officials who brief them. And in fact, I've been in that position, right? So I've been the subject of skeptical and probing questioning by the president and by cabinet members and members of the National Security Council. But never, and nor could I imagine a situation where the conclusions we've reached or the analysis that we're providing is questioned based on the motives of the people delivering that message, that they're being political. So to answer your question, Shane, and it's consequential, it's alarming, and it's dangerous to have that be the view of the president-elect, of the intelligence that he's receiving, that it has been politicized. It's dangerous to our national security. But to your question, Shane, on the first meeting, I would very much expect that the first person who's there is going to treat that briefing like they would every other briefing. There's not going to be any whiff of acrimony or controversy. The information is going to be delivered just as you would expect and hope that it would be delivered. I mean, and this is the last thing I'll say, I mean, on this question, which is, sure, I mean, the head of the CIA is a political appointee. The head of the FBI has been appointed and Senate confirmed. But everybody else, pretty much, in the intelligence community, everybody who's out on the front line collecting information, collecting intelligence, and everyone who's preparing the analysis are not political. And they're the ones who are preparing this information to be delivered to high-ranking government officials and the president. So it truly is not a political enterprise. And I think it just speaks of the lack of experience and perhaps worse of the president-elect that that's his perspective.
Carrie, one of the things that's come out in the reporting in the past few days is that daylight that I referred to between the FBI saying, we're not so sure this was done to help Trump, and the CIA saying, no, we think it was, may revolve around sort of different standards or methods for assessing information in the law enforcement context versus the intelligence context. Or in intelligence, you look at context, you maybe even intuit some things, whereas in law enforcement, you're looking for things that you might be able to prove in a court of law. As somebody who worked in national security in the Justice Department, in that kind of that first environment that I'm sort of scoping out there in terms of facts more as evidence and more concrete. And I'm curious what you make of these differences that are being reported in the assessment of what Russia was up to, and do you think that matters?
Yeah, so my sense, having been at the Justice Department and also worked in the intelligence community, is that this FBI-CIA split that's being reported and sort of emphasized in the reports over the last couple days is perhaps being a bit overplayed. An FBI versus CIA narrative is sort of convenient and I would argue maybe a little bit lazy, that's sort of where the reports automatically go. Intelligence assessments are based on the information available. And the CIA obviously has come to whatever is its assessment. The argument that the FBI, and I've seen this in various reports, that the FBI has to adhere to a court-ready level of evidence is not reflective of what they do on their intelligence side. So the FBI is an organization that has dual roles. It has a traditional law enforcement function that's primarily carried out through its criminal investigative divisions, and then it has a national security function, and the national security branch and the national security functions are part of the intelligence community. And particularly after September 11th, the FBI has gone through a significant transformation to enhance its national security and intelligence capabilities and the professionalism of its intelligence-related workforce. In other words, the workforce that is working on intelligence assessments, looking at bigger picture issues, and not simply gathering evidence for a crime. So I view these recent emphasis on the FBI versus CIA issue as perhaps a little bit overplayed. But picking up also on what Susan and Matt were describing, I think it's worthwhile to step back and look at what is the role of the intelligence community. And the role of the intelligence community is in sort of short shrift, twofold. One is to provide sort of tactical intelligence to warfighters, counterterrorism operators, intelligence analysts who are trying to generate sort of information that supports particular investigations or particular operations. But the other function is to provide bigger picture assessments and assessments of various national security issues that are going around the world to inform policymakers and to inform the president, who is their #1 policymaking customer. And so, so the challenge for the intelligence community in this current environment that they are finding themselves in with the president-elect is going to be to figure out how to reach him, how to communicate to him the value of what they do in a way that will hopefully inform his decision-making process going forward.
Right, right. Maybe, and not to be flip about this, but maybe it's like, his campaign aide saying Twitter or cable news is a way to get to him. You already see people in his circle, it seems, trying to figure out, well, how do we convey information to him in what we would see as sort of an unconventional manner? So that relationship seems like it's already being established just with the people in his own orbit. Tim, you wrote on Lawfare, right, about the question that has come up in recent days about whether electors in the Electoral College should receive some kind of a briefing or a readout from the intelligence community about what exactly happened with the Russia hacks. And this has been prompted by some electors coming forward. Talk a little bit about that, and in that context, what perhaps doing that would, in that kind of transparency, might do for the broader public's need, I think, clearly to understand what happened here.
Sure. Well, my basic position, which I thought about carefully, is whether the electors who've asked for a briefing should get one, and my conclusion was that they should, at some level of classification, get a briefing. And the reason is that there is a plausible constitutional argument that electors should exercise some independent judgment in making their choice. Some people agree with that argument and some people don't. But it seems to me that if there is such a plausible argument, then the intelligence community should treat the electors just the way they would treat any other elected official, whether it was a mayor, a governor, or a member of Congress who needs information to inform their decision. So, one thing we've heard today from Susan, from Carrie, and from Matt is that, yeah, there might be slight disagreement about the motive that the Russians had in engaging in the hacking, but there is overwhelming agreement that this hacking actually did take place for the purpose of interfering in the elections, that it's quite solid. The information that attributes the member of the Electoral College who's sitting there watching cable news like everybody else and reading various sources and hearing unnamed officials being quoted in stories, you could see that they would say, well, the president-elect thinks it might be some guy in New Jersey. I think that they have a right, frankly, under the Constitution to be informed directly about what is the intelligence community's view on this matter, and then they can make up their own mind as to whether it should matter in their vote. I also think that this should only happen if an elector requests it. I don't think that the intelligence community should be intervening and saying, hey, you have to come and get this briefing, because there may be electors who, again, don't view that as their constitutional role. But, it's unprecedented, no question. That's a completely unprecedented position that I'm taking, but the situation is unprecedented. We've never had the American intelligence community make an assessment like this between the time when the vote took place and the vote of the Electoral College took place. And it seems to me that, again, just as in any other situation in which the intelligence community needs to brief elected officials, this is no different.
Do you think, is part of this the need to then convey more broadly to the public going further than that October statement?
Yeah.
To go back to that October statement, just briefly, it's the intelligence community under the imprimatur of the Director of National Intelligence in the Homeland Security Department put out this, I think, really extraordinary statement, not only attributing the hacks to the senior-most levels of the Russian government, but attributing a motive to interfere with the elections. The intelligence community is usually very reluctant to attribute motive, even privately, in a briefing. Do you think that, so what you're talking about would go one step beyond that and try to convey to the public the gravity of this and maybe even show a little leg on what the evidence of it is?
I think so, if it can be done without disrupting sources and methods. There's a lot of public information in some cases from cybersecurity companies about why they think that these particular hacks were done by particular hackers. But basically, yes, the public, I think, has very serious questions about what happened before the election. With the statements by Comey and the FBI, this statement by the intelligence community, and then you tell us, this is sort of your average person sitting there saying, wait a second, I understand that there was this statement before the election, but now after the election they're going further and saying this was to help Trump. That's a very explosive conclusion. No question that's an explosive conclusion. Just like some of the statements made about the investigation of Hillary Clinton's email server were explosive at the time. And so I think there's a lot of review that needs to happen. Transparency needs to happen. And Congress needs to look at this and say, what in the world is going on with the intelligence community and the election? And I think it's a complicated story. I don't think that all the people involved are necessarily doing these things for the worst reasons that people think they might be, including Comey and others. But they have some explaining to do, and they should do that explaining.
Matt, do you think that, picking up on what Tim's idea is here, is there a way that the administration could, without compromising sources and methods, or at least to a point that was unacceptable to compromise them, craft more of a revealing public statement than has already been put out?
Yeah, I think definitely more could be said and needs to be said. I really defer to Tim and others who are studying this issue from a constitutional perspective on how that could impact the Electoral College. But just putting that aside, we have really a remarkable set of circumstances here where we have Russian interference with our election and apparently Russian effort to pick a candidate in our election. And this is just something that demands further inquiry and more transparency, whether that's Congress, a commission. There's going to be more to do to get to the bottom of this. And to your question, I think what Tim said is right about the intelligence community is reluctant to make a statement, or maybe you said this, Shane, that is as definitive as they made back in October. That was pretty extraordinary to be that definitive at the time. They've apparently gone further now in deciding or reaching the conclusion that the Russians were rooting for Trump. I agree with you, Carrie, completely that too much is being made of an FBI CIA rift. That seems to me to be overblown and sort of a convenient way for Congress to pick sides in this debate. I suspect that there is an opportunity for the intelligence community as a body, as a whole, under the DNI's leadership, to put out more information without compromising sources and methods about what we know, and to continue to be transparent here. And I think this is a situation where our democracy demands that level of transparency.
I want to get at sort of what you make of this if you are a 15 years in the intelligence community employee, or a recent addition to the intelligence community or the Justice Department or other parts of the national security community. Not only watching all of this, but taking into account many of the things that the president-elect and his soon-to-be advisors said about national security policy in the campaign, which we'll drill into a bit, as we go along in the discussion. But to take it sort of at a broad level and just recapping things like bringing back waterboarding and worse, his views on surveillance, on privacy, on drones, these kind of things, and a lot of perhaps assumptions that people make, and we'll talk maybe about whether those assumptions are correct, that there is sort of an authoritarian instinct in a national security policy of the Trump administration. Susan, you wrote very powerfully and pretty passionately about this question of whether, if you're a person in the IC who is, anonymous to the rest of the world, is not somebody who's going to be necessarily in the Oval Office briefing the president, but has to, on a daily basis, carry out and represent to the best of your abilities those policies, and at the same time defend your oath to protect the Constitution, what do you do? And kind of walk through a little bit your thinking about the thought process of that and what you've advised people in that position.
Right, so I'll even say sort of I wrote a little bit on this the day after the election, right, sort of really speaking to former colleagues in a public forum and saying it's your duty to serve, it's your duty to sort of stand guard on these institutions and also help our president succeed. Donald Trump was elected and we should all sort of wish for his success. Our fortunes are all tied here. A month later, I have found that position sort of tested, right? It was my sort of sincere hope that the rhetoric would be toned down, and we would see sort of more responsible discussions going on. Since then, I think almost every day has brought sort of a new challenge to those people. And so, look, I think there are a lot of people who are facing incredibly difficult situations and difficult decisions about whether or not they should stay and serve, both at the political level and also for that career staff. I don't think we should underestimate how consequential that is to our national security, not just for these 4 years or 8 years, but for 30 years, right? We have sort of groups of people who are graduating law schools and graduate schools and schools of foreign service that aren't going to the government. We have people who are leaving the intelligence community to take much more highly paid, sort of prestigious positions in the private sector. The people who serve in the intelligence community by and large do so out of a sense of duty and patriotism and wanting to be part of something larger than themselves. I don't think anyone on this stage has risked their lives for intelligence. Maybe Matt, I don't know what that guy did. But there are, it's not an overstatement to say that there are people who risk their lives for this information, and they do so because they think it matters, they think it makes a difference. And so this message coming from, literally the president-elect of the United States saying, what you do doesn't matter, I don't believe it, I question your motives, and I'm not going to listen to it. I think whenever we look at the group of people that are sitting in career positions, I think a lot of people are thinking, why am I doing this? Mm-hmm. If this causes sort of a mass exodus from the intelligence community, or sort of a large group of people that don't join the intelligence community, we could miss out on a generation of talent. The consequences of that sort of over time, I mean, really could be almost immeasurable.
So go ahead, Carrie. Yeah.
So I have a little different take on this. Appreciating sort of everything and the concerns that Susan has. The first is that I know that there's a lot of people, particularly perhaps in the libertarian community and people who might be here at the Cato Surveillance Conference, who perhaps had very significant concerns that a Trump administration is going to abuse surveillance authorities. And I know that is a real concern of some people in this space. Having worked at the Justice Department with the intelligence community, There were other reasons that I was not in favor of the Trump candidacy throughout the campaign. His potential abuse of surveillance authorities was not one of them. And that's because I do have a deep level of confidence in the institutional systems, in the laws and the institutional systems and the checks and balances and the oversight structures that exist, in the fact, as Matt alluded to, that the intelligence community is not made up primarily of political appointees. There are very few, only at the very senior levels. And so the workforce really is a workforce that is used to and trained in abiding by the law, abiding by the rules, abiding by policies. It's a very regulated, particularly at NSA, a very regulated environment. So those concerns I have a fairly significant degree of confidence in with respect to potential use of surveillance authorities in particular. There's some other areas, that maybe we can talk about later if folks are interested, that if I was in the privacy or civil liberties community, I would sort of pay more attention to. But the surveillance area is one that I think we can have a significant degree of confidence in the workforce. With respect to the workforce, though, and so I guess I understand that there's concerns, and certainly perhaps of people who are thinking about entering the workforce, there's some concerns. But I would say that having spent a lot of time in the national security community, this is not a community of snowflakes. Mm-hmm. All right, this is people who can take a little bit of heat. And so I guess I would say that I'm not quite as concerned that that people are going to flee the workforce, certainly if they've been there for a while. They've been through a lot of ups and downs, particularly in the last 15 years. They've felt political pressure, and so they've seen leaders come and go. And there's a good chunk of the workforce that knows that, sort of this too will pass. Yeah. And so, I'm confident that a significant part of the workforce is going to do what they've always done, which is to put their head down and do their job and let the senior leadership levels sort of work through this political challenge.
And for a lot of people, it is a job. Their options in the private sector might not be as obvious as we may think they are. So, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Do you want to go, Tim?
Go ahead.
Okay, so lots to say on this point, because I think you did it. I think you're right, Carrie. Talk about first talking about the policies, and let me just agree with you on. I think on the surveillance point to a certain degree. I think it will be tested on this under a Trump administration whether or not the checks and balances that have been put in place are sufficient. But I think that almost highlights the contrast with the rest of counterterrorism policy, where there's not those checks and balances, where the potential for abuse is much greater. Leading into the second question on, the debate about whether to work for a Trump administration. And, when the mantra is drain the swamp, and you are coming out of graduate school, and I'll tell you, at the National Counterterrorism Center, we had the pick of folks coming out to come work. They could have gone to Wall Street, they could have gone to Silicon Valley. They wanted to go fight Al-Qaeda. And we had an incredible workforce. And my gut, and if I was advising somebody in that position, whether to choose the intelligence community or to choose one of those other jobs, when the president talks about draining the swamp and talks about dismissing without evidence the considered views that you are working night and day to put out, I'd be hard-pressed to advise someone to do that. And that is extremely dangerous. And that's at the working level. And then sort of my friends who are trying to decide whether to work at a higher level is a sort of a different set of questions, but I think even more starkly put to somebody who is going to be in a position to actually implement the policies of registering Muslims or killing terrorist families or bringing back torture. That, I think, requires a degree of sort of moral searching about whether you would be willing to put yourself into a position to implement those policies that in some ways the person coming out of graduate school to join the intelligence community doesn't have to face. But I think across the board, this is and I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I think it's a crisis for our country when you look at where the intelligence community goes from a workforce perspective in the next 4 years.
So your advice is a useful reminder that even in a bureaucracy as disparate and large with tens of thousands of people as the intelligence community, views, tones, cultures, policies, they are set from the top.
Absolutely.
I was just
Let
going
Tim jump in, then you will come back.
Yeah, I was going to disagree to some degree with Carrie on this point on surveillance abuse. I came into the intelligence community from the ACLU in the middle of the second Bush term, and it was a very difficult and wrenching decision for me to make because my former colleagues really looked on this as going to the other side. The expansion of surveillance powers after 9/11 was very dramatic, but I never had that feeling. Either, on the inside certainly, but even before that, the question was always potential for abuse. I think that was the biggest concern we always had, was these were broad powers, very broad powers, and ways in which the checks and balances had gotten out of whack before 9/11 were being sort of shoved aside. And I think the question now actually is not potential anymore, but real abuse. And the reason I say that is two things. One is, a lot of the powers and controls that Carrie discussed are really executive branch powers. We're talking about Executive Order 12333, presidential policy directives, other kinds of directives, which can be changed. Now, it's not so easy to change it bureaucratically, but the power is still there in the Oval Office to change those, as long as you're not talking about a statute. And even with the statute, we saw with Stellar Wind in the Bush administration, there can be creative legal arguments to get around statutes that can be done. And I don't have any faith whatsoever in the Trump Justice Department or the Trump Intelligence Director's Office not to take those powers to the darkest corner of the room, even more so than under George W. Bush, I think. And then you put that together with what you might call the Trump factor, Bannon and the alt-right, Flynn, these people in serious positions of power in the White House, saying, gosh darn it, I know that there is evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood has infiltrated, these political groups. Go get it for me. Don't tell me that there isn't any evidence. Under our system, even with these controls, I think, when you loosen those controls potentially, and when you have that kind of pressure, there's a lot of discretion down there in the intelligence community, in the FBI, in the NSA, and how you interpret those rules and whether you interpret them strictly, the way that they are interpreted now, or whether you stretch them, is very much something that we need to watch out for. So I don't think that would happen overnight. It might take a precipitating event like a terrorist attack to make the worst abuses happen. But I do think that we have to be careful of assuming that because we have a system of checks and balances, that it's going to necessarily withstand this kind of test. I'm writing a book now called Beyond Snowden. I was told that I should mention that at this panel by my editor. So I'm writing a book called Beyond Snowden. And I am literally writing another chapter to the book, because there is another chapter of what's going to happen in the future. And I don't necessarily predict that we're facing this dystopian reality, but I do think that, in a way, there's a question mark at the end of this book, which was very much celebrating the transparency and checks and balances that I fought very hard to help work on when I was in the government. But now I think there's a question mark. I was hoping we would get some additional reforms in the next few years, and I think that to strengthen those checks and balances. And now I'm worried that instead of the glass being half full, which was kind of what my book was about, that there should at least be some position that perhaps the glass is in fact half empty. So I'm concerned about those things.
Gary, you want to make a point, and then Susan is going to jump in.
Sure. So I think for the reasons that Tim and Matt describe, the president-elect's leadership decisions in the national security space, who he puts into leadership positions, are of highly, highly significant consequence. And there are still some positions that we have not seen filled yet, the Director of National Intelligence being one very important one. And that is an area, and so some things that I would hope the president-elect would look for in terms of selecting the new DNI would be, first, somebody with an extraordinary amount of experience in the intelligence business. This is not a job for a novice, for somebody who's going to have a very high learning curve. So somebody with experience in the intelligence business, somebody with exceptional enterprise management skills. The intelligence community budget is over $50 billion, 17 different elements. You need an extraordinary manager and leader, and then also somebody who knows how to bring consensus, because there is sort of this web of different elements and players that are involved. And so it's a really important decision that he still has to make. And I think a position like that, if he selects somebody who has leadership, that will hopefully lower the temperature a little bit on the concerns about some of the atrocious policies that he proposed on the campaign trail, like creating a Muslim registry or bringing back torture, whatever that means. If somebody who is a professional, who is respected in the community, is selected for that position, I think that will give the workforce a significant breath of relief.
Susan.
So I think it's important that we be sort of both sides, right, left, sort of to the extremes, be really, really disciplined and candid about sort of what we're talking about, because this is sort of a perilous moment. So there is, especially when we talk about sort of the potential for surveillance abuses, right? So there's this question of things that are plainly illegal. They plainly violate statutes, so they're plainly unconstitutional. They plainly violate the laws of war. And then there's some question about could that actually happen? I'm personally relatively confident that it wouldn't happen. I think people would resign. I think people would refuse to do it. I think there's enough sort of bureaucratic safeguards. There's a separate question about sort of the existing policy. We are no longer at that chalk on the toes place, right? There is some space between the way the intelligence community operates right now and what it could do theoretically within the law that might nevertheless be either abusive or intrude onto civil liberties or be a bad idea, right? I think this is one of the things people are missing whenever we talk about Muslim registries, for example. We don't target Muslim populations partly because it's contrary to our values and sort of abhorrent to the founding vision of this country. We also don't do it because it's a bad idea that doesn't work. And so these are sort of those policy questions. But whenever Tim talks about the potential for surveillance abuses, I align far more with Carrie's sort of view. I don't think that it is it's not possible to violate the law or the Constitution at the NSA without lots and lots of people being aware of it. So that's lots of people in the judicial branch, lots of people in the legislative branch, and lots of people in the executive branch. And so I think that we should be focusing not on re-litigating, going back to sort of our ideological pre-commitments and having the same fights we were having sort of 6 months ago or 3 years ago, but instead of sort of saying, okay, what are the pre-political commitments here, and how can we actually look for reforms that are going to meaningfully respond to sort of this new threat. As someone who has been a strong defender of the intelligence community against even Tim specifically as sort of a critic and really has a lot of faith, I'll be candid that Trump has challenged some of my sort of core assumptions, including that we would only elect a mentally fit individual who loved the Constitution the way the rest of us do. I'll be candid about that. And so whenever I think about, okay, how does this shift me? What am I thinking about now that I wouldn't think about under even had a Jeb Bush or John Kasich or any Republican, Democrat, I wouldn't have been concerned. For me, I think that it's building in transparency mechanisms that can't be evaded. That making sure that the general counsel's offices of various agencies have to see those decisions, because I have a lot of faith that those general counsel's offices will do the right thing, will use their inspector generals, will use their intelligence committees, ensuring that congressional committees have insight, because I have a lot of faith that those congressional committees, if they see abuses, will act to enact statutes or bring it to the floor. And so those are the things, I just think that it's critical to really sort of think about what is different here, because if we end up having kind of the same debate that we've been having for the past, honestly, 15 years, that's where I think it'll be distracting and something really bad potentially could happen in terms of abuse.
So I think that I agree with the idea that things have changed and are different. And in fact, one thing I've thought about is how the national security community, in some ways, which was on the other side of many of those debates in the Bush years, may step in and be an ally of the civil liberties community on important issues, even if they disagree on specifics when it comes to things like Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act or other policy disagreements that they're going to continue to have. There may be an alliance on basic values. And in fact, that's one of the themes of my book, Beyond Snowden. So I agree with that. I agree with that. But I guess my point is that we did, I think about issues of presidential power with a likelihood that there would be different presidents of different political parties and political philosophies, but not with the idea that the president is kind of going and cheering on what we would see, certainly in the campaign, as straight up abuses. I mean, we had Richard Nixon as a president, but he didn't promise to engage in abuses openly in the campaign. We had to listen to the White House tapes to find out about what he really thought. Now we just follow Trump's Twitter feed, and we get the same kind of rhetoric that we used to get listening to those tapes. So I think what I'm worried about is not so much, relitigating those fights, but just looking at, just in a broader sense, the large scope of presidential discretion when it comes to surveillance, and thinking about how that might be abused. And we don't know; it hasn't happened yet, obviously. But we should be, when Susan and Carrie both say, well, they're not going to do something that's illegal or unconstitutional. I think that's right. But what concerns me is the boundaries of what is legal and what is constitutional under these. Just a couple of examples. Most of what the NSA does overseas is not regulated by statute or by the FISA court. Sharing of that information with more domestic agencies is primarily a function of Executive Order 12333. And what the FBI can do in terms of investigating a group, the hypothetical I gave of Bannon demanding we need to go after these groups because they're all tainted by Muslim extremism, that's very discretionary. And there's good reasons for that, actually. I mean, we've wanted to have FBI offices have a good deal of discretion in these threat assessments and lower level investigations. We've wanted to loosen up some of that information sharing. Those high walls were a problem for counterterrorism. So we've done these things, and we've put in place civil liberties officers like I was, general counsel's offices, inspectors general. We've had more transparency. So we've counterbalanced some of that with checks and balances. But what I worry about is what I call the Trump factor. Does that kind of civil liberties protection, which is based on a certain degree of, adhering to basic norms, does that function in a Trump administration? I think it functions in a George W. Bush administration and a Barack Obama administration. I don't think it necessarily does. When you've got civil liberties officers and general counsel's offices and maybe the Wall Street Journal writing about this, very broad surveillance program, let's say, in a year that I'm hypothesizing, does Trump, say, we've made some mistakes, let's scale this back and focus it and make it more effective, which is what we would hope, or does he double down and declare war on, his own overseers? It seems to me that all the evidence is he would do the second thing.
Matt.
And Tim and I have gone back and forth and argued on opposite sides of a lot of issues, and I'm finding myself sort of drawn into his perspective a bit, either a tribute to your advocacy, Tim, or just the state of my mind and mood. Because what I agree with the point that actually surveillance law has actually developed more than some of the other areas of, as I mentioned, sort of national security and counterterrorism law in terms of putting in these checks and balances. And so there is reason to think that somebody would blow the whistle if the Trump administration tried to do something that was illegal. I think that, and I fought hard, and for my 20 years in government, at least the last 10, when I worked on national security, for increasing information sharing, breaking down barriers to sharing information, foreign, domestic, within domestic agencies, and for the modernization of FISA, so that we could have a better approach to surveillance. But I will say that, at least for my part, I did not, as I fought for these changes, I did not bargain on President Trump. That was beyond my ability to imagine as a leader of the country in thinking about how these policies would actually be implemented by the chief executive. And so this is a time of sort of soul searching for me, kind of to what you, Susan said, what you said, Susan, that you got to sort of think about it now in a different paradigm. And then I would suggest that the way to think about it is, if you really want to sort of put yourself to the test, is not sitting here at Cato Institute in this panel, but the day after an attack like what we saw in Paris earlier this year occurs in Washington or New York or Chicago or anywhere, and there's 150 dead Americans. That's an attack that's been carried out by people connected to ISIS. And how the Trump administration responds when you have the statements that have been made by the leaders, by President-elect Trump about his view of what we should be doing with Muslims in this country, whether that's surveillance or torture of terrorists, or killing terrorist families, or the National Security Advisor saying that fear of Muslims is rational. And how does our country, as represented by our government, respond in a crisis to that scenario? And that, I think, is uncharted territory for me.
Just to sort of follow up on Matt's point, I do think it's worthwhile actually sort of stating the other sort of grounding here, especially whenever we sort of talk about 702 specifically.
Right.
So I don't
Just
support.
briefly explain 702 really quickly.
Right. So 702 is the section of the FISA Authorizations Act that permits not bulk collection, but collection targeted at foreign communications, but derived within the United States, based on broader selectors than sort of the requirements of the specific warrant. It's a split the baby between allowing the government to just search whatever they want, and then those particularized warrants. The controversy, by and large, extends to whenever the communications of Americans are incidentally collected during that targeting. And so FISA 702 is, there's a sunset provision, so it either has to be affirmatively reauthorized by the end of 2017, or it goes away, right? So there's a forcing function. We have to have this debate no matter what. Previously, I think there had been a broad assumption that we were probably heading for clean reauthorization, meaning reauthorizing it as it currently existed. Maybe there was some minor sort of questions about marginal transparency or civil liberties changes. Now there is a little bit more of a question about whether we'll see either 702 not being reauthorized, or whether or not we'll see really dramatic changes. Within that context, whenever I think about does President Trump sort of change my view of, for example, 702? No, I didn't support 702 as it currently exists because I super love the executive branch and think that it was cool information that they like to see. I saw it because I think that information keeps Americans safe. I think not just Americans, I think it keeps people around the world safe. For whatever sort of criticism there were about 215 and sort of other programs, this is, I would argue, one of the most important programs that the intelligence community has. And I think the president needs that information, whether or not he's Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George Bush. And so the challenge here is going to be how do we preserve that functional core of information that I just think is absolutely critical, while at the same time building in safeguards to ensure that the rules that exist are being followed, and also that we have prudent, wise sort of policy that overlays those basic statutory and constitutional protections.
So go ahead, Kara, if you want to make a comment.
Can I put a little finer
go
point
ahead.
on Section 702 a little bit? So as Susan described, it's a provision that was in the law that enables the government to target non-U.S. persons who are reasonably believed to be outside the United States for foreign intelligence purposes, and does so without requiring a probable cause warrant, but has approval by the FISA court for how the surveillance is actually conducted and what procedures the government has to follow. And picking up on Tim's point, where I think that there are potential areas of common interest amongst those of us who have historically been supportive of government efforts to conduct, have sort of robust surveillance authorities like 702, and those who are concerned about privacy. My perspective on that, given where we are currently, is that if the privacy community spends the next year fighting about 702, my view is that is a complete waste of their time. And it goes to the point of Section 702 is an area that is probably the most oversight-laden surveillance authority that we have. In the national security space, that's the statutory authority that has tons of oversight, congressional oversight, Department of Justice oversight, Office of Director of National Intelligence oversight. That's the most regulated area. And so I think that that is the area that folks should really be the least concerned about. If you want to talk about areas that I would find common ground on and where I think there should be kept a watchful eye, it would be if the new Attorney General decides to reopen FBI investigative guidelines for domestic operations and lower the standards for investigating Americans. That's an area to keep an eye on. If you want to talk about an area that should be of concern to civil libertarians, it's the proposal that I have not heard from the president-elect, but that I have seen, so I want to qualify that, but that I have seen in some reports about maybe things that are of interest to some of his advisors, would be the proposal to eliminate the Director of National Intelligence. The Director of National Intelligence creation was the single most important recommendation of the 9/11 Commission to improve the workings of the intelligence community. And in the post-Snowden environment, the DNI has been on the forefront of increasing transparency, assisting in the release of FISA court opinions that can be declassified, and ensuring that there is a common voice in briefing Congress. So those are areas where I think those of us who have perhaps been on different sides of issues would have common ground, and that I think are far more consequential than fighting over Section 702.
Susan, do you want to make a comment on that?
Just very quickly, I agree with a lot of what Carrie just said. And I think one of the things I've tried to do with my colleagues in the civil liberties and privacy community is to kind of remind them that actually 702 does have a lot of safeguards, and that if they want to look about NSA surveillance and big data and that issue, which is an important issue. I agree that the AG guidelines are equally, if not more important. They should be focused on Executive Order 12333 as much as they are, where there's less oversight. And that was part of my point, is that 702 is only about data inside the United States. And that's why you have to go to the FISA court. That's why there's these oversight mechanisms. Data that's outside the United States, still basically fair game for the NSA as long as they're not intentionally targeting a specific American citizen. And there's a ton of data all over the world these days. So, it's still a little bit screwy. Yes, Matt did a lot of jobs to modernize FISA in certain ways, but it's still a little bit screwy how the law treats data based on not so much the sensitivity of that data or even whether it's being, what the purpose is, but based just on physical location of the data. In a globalized world, it sort of doesn't make a lot of sense.
So, Susan, you made the point of 702 providing this, from the intelligence community's perspective, rich repository of information that is useful, that saves lives. It also comprises a significant portion of the president's daily briefing, we've been told. President-elect Trump, in a lengthy interview with Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, which if you haven't seen it, it's worth going back and looking at, actually, because he talks in great detail about a number of national security areas, talked about the fact that he has only received the daily briefing about 3 times, and gave some explanation for that. He said he doesn't need to be told the same facts over and over, which implied that there was some repetitive elements to the briefing that he found not useful for him. So praised the people who were giving him the briefing, which was an interesting sort of juxtaposition, considering he was sort of publicly fighting the CIA, but also praising the briefers, and said that the important thing to remember from his perspective was the vice president and other people who are coming into his cabinet are getting briefed, and he has let them know that if there's something that I need to know that you think is important, alert me, I am there at a moment's notice. So it's kind of seemed to set up this framework, it seems to me, where I don't need the brief every day. You tell me what I need to know if there's something new. I would like for you all to react to that. I mean, he is not the first person to decline getting the briefing every morning. That is not unique to this president. But what do you make of that in terms of, we're talking about these intelligence programs that not only provide information for the community, but do inform the president on the state of the world? What do you make of the fact that he's laid out this reaction to getting the briefing? Who would like to chime in on it?
So, like, I think it sort of goes back to evidence-based policy making, right? These are enormously complex decisions. It's really hard to get it right. This is a little bit like a doctor saying, you know what, I don't care so much about the x-rays or the tests or the blood tests. Those are like, there's a lot of math. It's like, that's boring. I think you have, I don't know, and throws out whatever sort of his gut instinct is. I don't know, sometimes it might be right, and sometimes tests are wrong, and this isn't an exact science, but if you were looking at if your doctor was doing that, you would fire that person. You would say, that's not how good decisions are made. Good decisions are made because you collect the available evidence. Now, sometimes it is tedious, it is in the weeds, it is detail-oriented. Trust me, I was as disappointed as anyone to discover that NSA was a lot less like a Bourne movie. There was a lot more paperwork involved than I had anticipated. Right, this stuff is things that might sound repetitive to him. To somebody versed in intelligence, actually understands, no, this is nuance, this is detail, this is significant. And so to have, I think this is sort of going back to his initial statements of kind of the general hostility to the evidence or information. That, frankly, is scary to me. You know, we have troops deployed around the world. The U.S. intelligence apparatus isn't just consequential to the United States; it's consequential to our allies. These are areas in which we really want someone to take it seriously, to try and be getting it right, and to have someone say, like, you know, not just, you know, PDB, not PDB, but intelligence, not intelligence, paired with this kind of general hostility to the intelligence community. You know, you guys got it wrong on WMDs, so who cares what you think? That to me is some of the most, frankly, frightening things that we're hearing.
Does it comfort you, though, just to jump on that, and I want to hear Carrie's point, that he's delegated, authorized, however you want to look at it, sort of to use your analogy, the other doctors under him on his team to get the x-rays and the blood tests and all that kind of thing every day?
So as long as those doctors are the ones making the decisions, there's not a ton of clarity here. There's some sort of speculation that Vice President-elect Pence will be sort of the day-to-day president, while Donald Trump focuses on making America great again. So there's a little bit of speculation there. At the same time, Donald Trump appears to be making the appointments, making the decisions, and so. Yeah, you want that person to be informed. If he is not going to be interested in putting the work in and really examining the evidence and doing you know, taking in sort of the facts, you would hope that he would also have the judgment to understand that he shouldn't be making those decisions then, right? That there would be really sort of a clear delegation.
Carrie.
So 2 quick points. So one is, so as this changes every single day, right? CNN reported yesterday that the Trump team says that he is now receiving an intelligence briefing 3 times a week, which from my perspective is a really positive development and big improvement from what was being, you know, what he had relayed just last weekend. And I think part of that is because based on what he demonstrated throughout the campaign, there's concern in the national security community that he really doesn't have a good knowledge of world events and security challenges, and so that he would really benefit from his national security and his intelligence briefings, and that one would hope that he would take advantage of this time before the inauguration to really develop a relationship with the intelligence community and become better informed. And that's, again, speaks to the question of how does he yet understand that the intelligence community is there to assist him in his decision-making process, and can tailor their reports to areas that he wants to focus on. And that's where we really need to see some improvement in terms of him fleshing out who his senior leadership team is, who is going to be giving him the briefings. But I think that if it's in fact true that he is receiving his briefings 3 times a week versus just a couple since the election, then that's an improvement.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, the problem is this isn't about, I mean, that's good, but this isn't about like how many times a week you get the briefing or whether it's the PDB or, the presidential daily brief that he reads and then gets briefed or he just hears the briefing. I mean, presidents do this differently over in history, and in my experience, President Bush and President Obama handled it differently. But it does come back to how the world actually works and how people make important decisions. And they don't make decisions with the idea that, well, if something important happens, come tell me. And that's absurd. And that's not the way somebody in a leadership position who is responsible for putting American lives at risk all the time should be making decisions. So the information that comes to the president, if you think of this as a pyramid, at the base of the pyramid, there's the vast amounts of intelligence that are collected by the intelligence community, and it works its way up this pyramid to the very top, where senior level officials within the intelligence community with the best writers and the best analysts are making judgments about what their most important customer needs to know, the President of the United States. And that's at the very top, whether that's an in-person briefing or a PDB. And if the president is dismissive of receiving that information and is disdainful of facts in making those decisions, as we've seen, then we are in a very perilous moment when the decisions, these are the decisions the president makes and is accountable for making, not the vice president, not the national security advisor. We've elected a president to make these decisions, are not decisions that he makes once a month or even once a week. They are decisions that the president is called upon to make multiple times a week on counterterrorism operations in particular that involve the deployment of U.S. military forces and putting American lives at risk. So the notion that we can sort of accept a chief executive who is in the position of tell me if something important happens is truly alarming.
Carrie, yeah, quick point.
Just a very quick follow-up. I think that's exactly right. And just to put a finer point on it, the deliberate rejection of briefings actually, I think, should be viewed not as sort of a benign, I'm busy doing other things, but actually as an abdication of responsibility. So when a senior executive in government doesn't want to know what's in the briefings, that I think can be viewed through a lens of, therefore, should something happen as a result of the information that's in that briefings, they are not accountable. And we have seen, unfortunately, some members of, I can think of one in particular, a member of Congress who has done this. And when they decline a briefing and then therefore can speak publicly at will because they don't know, that's not a benign thing. That is a deliberate strategy.
Right. So, Carrie, I agree entirely with what Carrie just said about sort of willful ignorance. And, there's a lot of, we've had a big debate about surveillance and privacy, and I've made the point that you can simultaneously believe that there need to be more controls on surveillance, and that because there is a lot of surveillance and data that's being gathered by agencies that know what they're doing, they probably know a lot of stuff. Those two things make sense. I've actually gotten some pushback or criticism saying, "Oh, well, now you guys like the intelligence community." I always liked the intelligence community, for me personally, but it's yes, that's the point, right? They gather information and they have it available to the president. We can debate 702 and whether it has the right balance. But it is incredibly valuable. It provides all this information for the presidential daily brief. If the president's not reading it, what's the point? And I think Carrie's point is well taken, that this is not just a sort of lack of competence or wanting to be, do other things that are less boring. It is a deliberate strategy. I agree with that. I think the people who push aside information are doing so because it pushes aside the responsibility. Since I didn't know that information, I can do what I like, and that's very, very worrying.
We have some time now for audience questions, so if there's something you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. Why don't we go over here to the gentleman in the pink tie here. Please wait for the microphone to reach you so that the online audience and everyone here in the audience can hear you as well, and please do make it a comment and not a lecture. Thank you. Or a question.
Or a question, how about
a question, not a lecture. Thank you.
I come to this from a great
I'm sorry,
fear.
give your name and affiliation, sir. I'm sorry.
Woody Kaplan, the Civil Liberties List. I come to this, as the name implies, with a great fear of the imperial presidency. Started with Lyndon Baines Johnson. This is not partisan. And I'm taken by a lot of the comments. I love Susan, but I think you might be naive, but you know more about it than I do. The U.S. attorneys with whom I've spoken have told me they can get away with virtually anything by creating probable cause and walking across the hall from the NSA to AT&T or something and say, we need these records or we need this information. The whole idea of having the watchers watch themselves, those employees of the organizations, because they're so full of goodwill, I'm greatly skeptical of that. And I'm greatly skeptical of almost all of the internal oversights. And I hope you guys would comment on that a little bit. Am I just paranoid, or am I particularly paranoid?
Sure. It's a great question. So why should people believe people who are sitting up here saying, trust us, these are rigorous mechanisms of oversight that were put in place and they work? Who would like to address that?
I'll do a quick comment. So, look, want to be sort of candid. It's possible that I'm wrong, right? I have a particular degree of faith that honestly boils down to, I know those people, and I think they would resign, right? And I understand that's not a formal institutional sort of protection. That said, I really do think this goes to what is the strength of our faith in sort of in the institutional protections and what those look like. So whenever I look back at the sort of the history of the NSA, including things that occurred before I was there, for example, the President's surveillance program. The thing that is particularly concerning about the order of events is that the General Counsel's office wasn't told. The General Counsel was told kind of at the very end of events. That's a real problem. The way the agency is currently constructed, that could not happen again. I don't believe that could happen again. That these programs could exist without multiple members of the General Counsel's office and members of Congress knowing. Now, I'm sure that's true only because the bad thing happened and then there was a response. There are probably lots of different pockets of the government in which that potential hasn't occurred yet, and so there hasn't been a response. I think the way to address this is not necessarily to attack sort of the substantive, does this invade civil liberties? Is there a privacy right? So what is the sort of the substance of the authority? But instead really think about how do we get multiple branches of government involved in that oversight process? How do we build in technical compliance mechanisms, right? Do as much as possible to make sure we have multiple eyes and it's not just the watchers watching themselves.
Anybody else want to briefly respond to that?
Just to say that I largely agree with that, but with the caveat that policies, of course, can be changed. And that was the point that I was trying to make about the power of the executive branch. The director of NSA works for the Secretary of Defense, and the General Counsel's office advises the director. So if Trump's Attorney General says, this is my opinion about what the law means and what the Constitution means, and there's no court decision that says that Attorney General opinion is wrong, as a structural matter, it doesn't matter what the General Counsel of the NSA thinks about that, whether he disagrees or she disagrees with it. We saw a little bit of, and that was the rationale for denying access. But there's a broader point here. I mean, the president has a lot of power and is in charge of the executive branch, and all of these mechanisms are important, and I believe in them, not just because I know a lot of those people and was one of those people, but because I think that they were well designed in many cases. But they are still nevertheless within an executive branch process, and they rely on types of control, and this is my biggest concern, is not so much the calibration of how much or little you do and how close to that chalk line you get, but they rely on a president of the United States taking that in as a control on his behavior, even though they work for him. They rely on a kind of degree of shame being required. And that's true, of course, even of checks and balances for Congress and the courts. So those are, Jack Goldsmith wrote a wonderful piece in Lawfare called Libertarian Panic, criticizing people like me, saying that we're involved in a libertarian panic. Not so much criticizing, actually he was praising us in a sort of odd way, saying it's a good thing you're panicking because that's the reason these abuses won't happen. But it still may be a bit of a panic. And part of my response was, well, yeah, that was the American Revolution, was a libertarian panic, because you look at that list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence, and they're kind of out there. I mean, they're not a fair description of what the British were actually doing. They're sort of over the top. So in a way, our country was founded on the basis of a libertarian panic. But also making the point that I think that all the controls Jack, which come from his wonderful book, Power and Constraint, which I largely agree with, work for different political philosophies, different political parties, but do they work for Trump? That's a very open question in my mind.
The next one I saw was the gentleman in the middle here in the fourth row with his hand up. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Ahmaduddin Ahmed with the Minaret of Freedom Institute. You all seem to agree that and I want to get back to this question of the DNC hacking by the Russians. You all seem to agree that the reason Trump doesn't accept that is because of his disdain for the facts. But I have two questions, and I'm not a Trump supporter, but I can see why Trump supporters might feel a disconnect from the people in power. There are two questions about facts. You criticize Trump for his attributing political motives to the CIA, but don't address the precedent of the Clinton supporters who attributed political motives to the FBI. Would you comment on that? The other question is, you might not want to accept Julian Assange saying that he got his information not from Russian hackers, but from a DNC insider, because you don't believe Julian Assange. But he was supported by Craig Murphy, who said he met the DNC insider, and that's where the information came from, not from Russian hackers. Would you address that?
We'd like to address either of those points briefly.
So briefly, people who allege that Jim Comey weighed in for political reasons, I think we're wrong. I think that was an unfair assessment. You can talk about whether or not it was the right decision or the wrong decision, and whether it was a wise decision or an unwise one. But to the extent people accused that activity of being political, that's plainly true, or that's plainly false. Some of the leaks that occurred after, sort of in the final week of the election, I did find deeply troubling, and do have concerns that there were potential political motivations there. But that's just as sort of Trump deserves criticism. People who took shots at the FBI on those grounds, I think fairly deserve criticism as well. As to this question of whether or not we should take the words of Julian Assange and Craig Wright over the unanimous judgment of the U.S. intelligence community, that's a non-starter of a question. We're talking about signals intercepts, forensic documents, even the weight of public evidence. The notion that there is not a direct connection between the hacking of the DNC, the passage of those documents to WikiLeaks and their ultimate dissemination, I think even from the outside is absurd on its face. Added with the sort of the very detailed intelligence assessment provided in October, I don't think there's any credibility to those claims at all.
Very brief.
Very brief. The questions that you raised, sir, I think, though, do demonstrate why there needs to be a bipartisan congressional investigation so that people can have better answers to these questions and have some confidence that an actual investigation was conducted and that it's done in a bipartisan way.
Okay, and one last right here, very brief. Yeah, on the end here.
Hi, Liza Goiting with the Brennan Center for Justice. Is this on? Okay. I'm not nearly as sanguine as some of you that we can rely on, for example, the general counsels to protect us. The key general counsels are political appointments. We've heard the name of David Addington floated for the general counsel of DOD. That doesn't give me great confidence. But I also agree with Tim that I think the greatest risk is not blatantly illegal conduct, but conduct within the great discretion that has been allowed by our expanded laws. And it's a bit frustrating for me to hear Matt say, when we worked on these laws, we never thought about the potential of a Trump, because civil libertarian advocates like myself were making that case as hard as we could. As much as you trust this administration, what about the next one? Look at our history. This is about potential for abuse, but the question isn't if, it's when. So I feel like but anyway, I actually do have a question. And my question is, despite what I just said, I certainly have a lot of respect, Matt, for your perspective, and Carrie and all of you. And you talked about the fact that you think the greatest threat to civil liberties abuses isn't from the surveillance side, but other counterterrorism policies. And I know, Carrie, you mentioned the DIOG and the FBI guidelines. What are some of the other counterterrorism areas where you feel like the potential for abuse is greatest, and where maybe some of us should be focusing maybe more than the sort of laser focus we've had on surveillance?
And you'll have to give us the truncated version.
Very short, because this could be a long conversation. The respect is mutual, Elizabeth. So, and I think, I do think that the focus on, that we were engaged in, you and I, talking about 702 and really trying to figure out where exactly to draw the line on searching for U.S. person information, for example, really highlighted that controversy, that debate had really become really focused on some very specific and kind of narrow but important issues. I think we've moved way beyond that now, and in terms of the things to be concerned about. So to answer your question, I do think that the greatest area of risk from a civil liberties perspective is domestic law enforcement. And again, taking the scenario of the day after or the weeks after an attack in the United States, the wide discretion which we rightly give to the FBI, and in particular to local police departments and law enforcement, to investigate crimes and to preserve our safety domestically, there is the potential, when the leadership of our country makes the statements that we've talked about making, right, in terms of the Muslim community and how we should be reacting after a terrorist attack. I think the greatest fear, and I'm not sure what you're much better positioned to think about how to constrain those activities, but the idea of greater surveillance that doesn't even rise to the level of going to a judge, of investigative powers that law enforcement, that police officers, and again, we're talking like local police departments, are going to have to basically be in a position to I think intrusively be involved in neighborhoods and communities in a way that is not American.
Please join me in thanking this great panel for a really stimulating discussion. We have a 15-minute break, yeah?
Yeah, it's closer to 10.
Okay.
So we will reconvene here at 10:45 for a panel on government hacking. So take 10 minutes, recaffeinate if need be, hit the bathroom. Also outside on the table we have, because we are trying to truncate our introductions to be able to get right to the discussion, we have extended panelist biographies on a packet outside. Those watching at home can go to cato.org and find full panelist bios there. Please join us in a few minutes. Thank you. Welcome back to the morning session of the Cato Institute's 2016 Surveillance Conference. We heard a lot on our first panel about hacking by the Russian government, but our government, too, increasingly finds it necessary in an era when crimes may take place entirely in cyberspace to engage in computer network exploitation, hacking, as a mechanism of conducting searches, ideally searches authorized by the Fourth Amendment. But this raises a whole welter of questions. Is searching via hack fundamentally different from conventional physical search or indeed from wiretaps? Is the recent change to Rule 41 of criminal procedure, expanding the government's authority to use hacking techniques, an appropriate mechanism, or is this something that Congress should develop its own framework for? What should the posture of the intelligence community be towards vulnerabilities it discovers, given that, for example, we recently found a leak of NSA hacking tools that had been hoarded, vulnerabilities that were not disclosed, leaving routers manufactured by many major companies vulnerable. So to address these and the difficult questions of how to regulate hacking by the government for legitimate law enforcement or intelligence purposes. We have a fantastic panel that will be introduced by really probably one of the best national security reporters out there. You have no doubt, if you follow surveillance and intelligence and national security issues at all, relied on her excellent work over many years. Ellen Nakashima of the Washington Post.
Thank you very much, Julian, and thanks to Cato for sponsoring this conference and this panel. I'm going to introduce the panelists now. To my immediate right is Kevin Bankston, Director of the Open Technology Institute at New America, think tank for the digital age. To his right is Amy Stepanovich, a surveillance and cybersecurity expert at Access Now, a human rights group. To my left is Matt Blaze, renowned cryptographer and associate professor of computer and information science at the University of Pennsylvania. And to his left is Richard Downing, acting deputy assistant AG in charge of cybercrime investigations. So Julian gave quite a good and concise introduction to the issues, so I think we'll just dive right in. Take notes, though, as we discuss, and because we'll be leaving some time at the end for your questions. So Julian mentioned earlier this month a new rule change took effect called change to Rule 41, which allows a judge in one district to approve a warrant for law enforcement to hack computers outside the district. It allows the government to conduct remote access searches, or to deposit malware on computers, basically for two purposes. One, to identify IP addresses of computers whose locations are unknown, and two, to identify the IP addresses of computers that have been, say, enslaved by a botnet. So Richard, let's start with you. Why does the government need this rule change, and in what kinds of investigations?
Thanks, Ellen. The rule change is brought about by the advance of technology. This rule was first promulgated back in 1917, so it's almost 100 years old. And basically the idea of Rule 41 is to set the rules for when the government or how the government obtains a warrant for the search of a location. So this is the rule that governs searches of businesses and homes when there is probable cause and particularity and all of the bells and whistles that go along with our constitutional protections. The problem was that in 1917, the rule makers thought, rightfully at the time, that the investigators would know what court to go to. And the rule was, if you want to search a property in a particular district, you go to the court in that district. The difficulty that has arisen is twofold, and they are both problems that were created as technology has advanced. The first one is that we have near-perfect anonymity systems that are now built that prevent law enforcement from being able to identify what the location of the computer is. So networks such as the Tor network, which creates an anonymization mechanism so that when an offender, say someone who's interested in exchanging images of child sexual exploitation, wants to communicate with others, he can do so through the network and fairly effectively prevent law enforcement from knowing where his home is in order to get a warrant for it. And so the one primary mechanism, value in this rule change, all the rule change does is say, in those circumstances where the location of the computer is obscured due to technology, so it's a very slim thing. In those cases, you can go to any court that has that relates to the crime that's under consideration. So in 1917, that wasn't an issue. Today, it is an issue, and so the only change that's made is to allow investigators to know which court they go to apply. All the same rules that would normally apply to warrants apply in this circumstance.
Amy, Richards makes it sound like this change, he says it's very narrow, very restricted, and only in these cases where the location of the computer is unknown. What do you say to that? And I think some civil libertarians have raised concerns about the removal of the jurisdictional limits. Why?
Sure. So the rule was actually one of the few practical limitations we had in place to really broad government hacking. And one of the problems with government hacking is that Congress has never considered this and has never passed a law explicitly allowing it. And the reason why that's important is because hacking raises all sorts of increased risks from other types of searches, wiretapping, stored communication searches, things that warrants have typically been used for. And so when you look back when the Wiretap Act was passed, it was passed because it was considered, wiretapping was considered particularly invasive. And the problem is hacking can be even more invasive than wiretapping, but we have no substantive authority, which means we have no additional protections that we think we need in place for hacking to begin with.
How so? How can it be more invasive?
Sure, so any number of ways, and I believe Matt might know a little more of the technical pieces of this than I do, but it is very hard to determine when you put malware, or the government says that this is not malware if they're using it, but when you put something onto a computer, it's very hard to figure out how that is going to interact with that computer, even if you test it, even if you have some sort of understanding. I believe Stephen Bellavin, who is a colleague of Matt's, has talked about an update to iPads. Apple tested the update, they knew exactly what they were looking for, and it ended up bricking any number of devices when the update was actually pushed through. So it ends up having a lot of unpredictable impacts.
Matt, did you want to add a quick word there?
So I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that all of this hacking, or at least a large fraction of what we call government hacking and remote search, has at its core taking advantage of some kind of flaw or software bug in the systems that they're searching. And in some cases that might be a relatively simple thing, like convincing somebody to click on an email link through something that's not sufficiently authenticated. In other cases, it might be a much more subtle, much more technical exploitation of essentially an unintended behavior on the computer platform. And what that means is that, first of all, we can't predict with 100% certainty what its behavior is going to be and what its scope is going to be. We can't be sure that it won't get out of control. We can't be sure that it won't over-collect. And under some circumstances, this may be an acceptable risk, but it's one that Congress has never explicitly addressed. Judges almost certainly don't understand when they're issuing these warrants. And we're really on very much uncharted territory, both technically and legally.
Do you want to
I just wanted to add to that.
Richard, go ahead.
I think there's a broad concern about this ultimately led to basically a tacit approval by Congress of remote access searches, which they've never done before and which we've never really had any meaningful policy conversation about and actually know very little about, even though we do know, thanks to FOIA, that the government's been doing it for at least 15 years. But I also, on the particular risks, there's also, in comparison to wiretaps, there's a difference between me wiretapping you for 30 days or say 90 days with extensions and me having access to your entire computer and everything on it and the camera on it and the microphone on it and the accounts that might be accessible from it. Recognizing that the government does have a problem, how do we identify these people who are using anonymizing proxies? I would have been more understanding, putting aside that broader question of tacit approval of a tactic we've never really talked about. I would have been more comfortable with a rule that said, if they're obscuring their location, you can do a remote access search to obtain their location and nothing else, and then go to the appropriate court, if it's even in the United States, and get a warrant to seize the computer. But that's not what this did.
So you're saying that there aren't sufficient restrictions on the authority here. Richard, could you address that, please, that point?
Sure. I think the important thing to understand here, which I alluded to at the beginning, is that there are many rules that already apply every time that the government wants to use a warrant. we still have to comply with the Wiretap Act if indeed that would be part of what the execution would be. But more importantly, the Fourth Amendment has many different layers of protections. First of all, you'd have to have a warrant that presents probable cause and particularity. That is, you have to specify particularly which computers that you would be involved with. Then there has to go to an independent judge who gets to review it and evaluate the facts that are presented and decide whether this is a justified search. Then, layered on top of that, there's a Fourth Amendment requirement that the execution be reasonable, that it can't be overreaching and overbroad. Further, there's many layers of safeguards and review after the fact. So if there is any over-collection, that's the kind of thing that our system is very good at ferreting out through the process of discovery and through criminal prosecution, where suppression would be a remedy if the Fourth Amendment's been violated. And the victims get to sue the government if there is a problem or a constitutional violation. What I'm saying is there are a lot of rules that are involved here, and in our view, those are the kind of protections that are important in protecting our constitutional rights. Of course, we're open to a discussion about whether additional rules might be useful, but I think the important question to ask is, what is it about the current system of robust safeguards is it insufficient to address this kind of collection?
What sorts of safeguards do you have in place to account for the sorts of technical issues that Matt raised, and also, potential over collection? For instance, how do you notify victims who might have?
Right. So the question of, is it possible that the government's activity could damage a computer or do something inadvertent or inappropriate in the course of doing what the thing is intended to do, which would be to collect evidence of the case. Of course, as searches happen in the real world, searches in online context or remote searches also have risks inherent with them. Nothing is going to be perfectly risk-free. I would say, though, in the majority or the sort of heartland of cases where a targeted remote search is done against a particular individual's computer, the risk, or anyway, the potential harms are really quite limited. The computer stops working. Okay, that's bad. It's not something anybody would want, but it's hardly some sort of broad systemic problem. I think what Matt was alluding to is the fact that the second piece of the rule is useful in the context where there are many, many computers perhaps that have been infected by bots. That is, malicious software is already installed on those machines. Criminals are controlling those machines, often from outside the United States, and bad things are happening. And so the question is, if, and we haven't done exactly this, if there were an opportunity to do some sort of search of all those computers in order to mitigate the bot, that is to liberate those computers from the hands of the criminals who are controlling them. In that situation, is it possible that you could have inadvertent results? And I think the answer is, as I said, also possible. In the past, when we've done this sort of thing, though, we've been very careful and very thoughtful, and we've worked with computer security experts both outside of the government and inside the government to try to make sure that whatever we're doing is going to do no harm, and to our best to do that. We do tool validation and testing. And indeed, so far, we have a clean record of being able to do this effectively, but also, of course, we want to continue working with the private sector and others to make sure that these tools are used appropriately. I think the key question I would have, and I'm interested to see if any of the panel have thoughts on this, is at the same time that there is a potential risk over here, we have a very real risk that is ongoing harm to the people who have those computers. And when you have situations where hospitals are having their computers bricked as a result of ransomware until the ransoms are paid, I think we have to really seriously consider whether some potential risk over here is balanced by the fact that we have a very real damage that's going on and it's being sought to be prevented as a result of this sort of activity.
So I'd like to react to that a little bit. So first of all, let me start by saying that I'm not speaking from a position of being unconditionally opposed to remote searches. In fact, with my colleagues Steve Belevin, Susan Landau, and Sandy Clark, who's here, we wrote a paper on the technical inevitability and preferability of remote searches in certain cases. But I think it's really important not to be too confident about how well these tools work, particularly as we scale up. I mean, first of all, for precisely the same reason that you're able to do remote exploitation of computers, software is hard. Software is so hard that, in general, we don't know how to build it correctly. And software with security implications is particularly hard, particularly fragile. Again, particularly when it's being installed on a computer whose configuration you may not actually be fully aware of. And so I think, any confidence that these tools are actually working as intended has to, be understood in the context of this is not just a hard problem, but it is the fundamental problem of computer science, which is that we don't know how to build, in general, reliable software at scale. And so, you're working in absolutely treacherous territory when you do this. And what that means is that, first of all, the only thing that we know that works is relentless scrutiny. In the case of, the legal system, a discovery process where the defense gets to apply scrutiny to that would obviously be something that would be, not just nice, but probably essential, and other kinds of just relentless scrutiny to this. The other problem is that when a judge is authorizing this, they're authorizing tools that they very likely don't fully understand both the scope of and the risks of, because this is largely new territory. When a judge authorizes a search warrant to, physically break into a house with a no-knock warrant, a judge pretty well understands what precisely that is and what can go wrong. It's very unlikely that a warrant for a specific house is going to end up inadvertently searching an entire neighborhood or an entire city. In the case of a remote computer search, both the targeting, the scope of what's collected, and the potential for collateral damage are really much more difficult to pin down. It's easy to say what the tool is intended to do. It's harder to say what the tool actually do. So this is very difficult technical territory that we're on.
And so, Kevin, do you think we need a legislative framework to regulate these sorts of remote access searches? And how would you account for the technical difficulties in such legislation?
That's a big one. I mean, ultimately, absolutely, we need a legislative regime to govern this, just like we have for wiretaps, especially considering this raises all the same issues that wiretaps raise, as well as a bunch of other unique ones. I'm not certain how best to address the issue of minimizing the technical risk from the deployment of the tools. Certainly, I appreciate whatever internal measures the DOJ is engaging in to try and, quality assure that. But that's just one branch of our government. We actually need Congress engaged in that discussion. We need the courts engaged in a way that they haven't been so far, because, as Matt says, they often don't understand what they're approving. And there were some interesting transcripts from one of the cases where a NIT, a network investigative technique, has come up, where the judge was struggling to understand what the concept of, wait, you send instructions to the computer? What is that? What is it? Are you calling it? Like, what do you mean by sending instructions to the computer? They're not actually necessarily grokking that we are installing new software on the computer that is going to do these operations and send back this information, and that's a problem. And I take Rich's point about the Fourth Amendment as the rule, but I liken this to, we have a problem of the surveillance systems, both in terms of law enforcement and in foreign intelligence, being so secretive that it effectively prevents us from making good policy making on them. One of the best examples is in 2005, when we finally learned, thanks to one buck in the system magistrate who published an opinion, that the government had been doing live cell phone tracking for over a decade without warrants, and in fact using a statutory authority that's supposed to be reserved for stored records. And we didn't even know. There weren't public discussions about this. There weren't public court decisions about it. We had no idea it was happening. And we see this same kind of ratcheting up phenomena in foreign intelligence. Peter Swire wrote a great article about this called The System of Foreign Intelligence Law. I wrote a similar article about applying his ideas to law enforcement called Only the DOJ Knows. And so to hear the just trust the Fourth Amendment and that we in the courts are going to figure it out, when, as I said, they've been doing this for a decade and a half and we're only now just talking about it, rings kind of hollow. I also want to talk a bit about the botnet provision. One, I think it's a misnomer. What it says is, if we are investigating a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, crime, an unauthorized access crime, and the computers or media we want to search are in 5 or more districts, then we can go to any of those districts. So one, it's not limited to botnets. It could be used, for example, as an alternative to busting in and grabbing the computers of a suspected hacker. Hey guys, let's just do it from our desktop and remotely search his computer before we announce ourselves by busting in and taking his computer. But also in terms of the botnets, we're talking about, potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. That's why we've been talking about this in the context of mass hacking, who are innocent people whose computers have been unauthorizedly accessed and are now being used in a botnet. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of innocent people whose, you might say it's not a big deal if someone's computer gets destroyed, but I think for that individual, it's kind of a big deal.
What do you mean by destroyed? It would actually
when he said, it would not be, hopefully it would not explode or anything, but yes, would become non-functional.
There's some precedent for exploding phones, right? Yes.
And but it raises the question of how do we handle those people? Because those people, they're likely never to learn. Like say my refrigerator, my refrigerator that's been part of a botnet gets accessed, and in the process the government gets a lot of sensitive data about, well, my diet. We could pick a more sensitive Internet of Things item for the hypo if you like. They're never going to be prosecuted, and I can't think of any way you'd notify that person.
That was one of my questions, actually. So Richard, mass hacking, mission creep, notification, lots of questions for you to answer there.
Well, I guess if I could respond to this question about whether...
Actually, I'm sorry. One very important addition, 10 seconds. I'm also very concerned. I've heard Richard, as well as other people, publicly say that this provision will help them go after and shut down botnets, implying an intent to actually disrupt the functioning of the computer in some way, and I don't see how Rule 41 authorizes that beyond a search or seizure of data. And that really worries me. If we're turning the warrant into a stick that we can actually damage stuff with, that's a new development.
So I'm not sure I can answer all of the points made, but I do want to make a couple of points. First of all, on the question of secrecy and whether this could be done in the shadows and we never know about it. Actually, that's one of the strengths of having this be part of Rule 41, is that it's going to make sure that these things are brought to judges and approved, and that there will be clarity when these things come to court, because there will be litigation around it and there will be suppression motions. And in fact, the court system is pretty good at sussing out the issues and trying to figure out what the answers to these questions are. And indeed, right now, as a result of the investigation of a Tor hidden service, a website on the Tor network that involved the exchange of images of child sexual exploitation by about 100,000 users. This investigation resulted in a remote search. I can't go further into the investigation, but what I can say is that there are at present hundreds of these cases now that are going to be brought across the country as these cases are being brought. So I think we're going to see courts looking at these questions. I think this is exactly what we would want as far as transparency. On the question of whether the exact details of the exploit should be disclosed to the defendant, I think that's a very interesting question that we are beginning to see in the litigation around this. It's a question of discovery. How much does the defendant need to know? And of course, the defendant in cases have constitutional rights to defend themselves and are entitled to material that would help them in their defense. Of course, balanced against that, a little bit on the other side, is if you disclose this vulnerability or this method of entry into the computer, then it will no longer be useful. That is, it will be outed and it will not be, presumably systems will be patched and it will be no longer useful for the purpose of the law enforcement activities. But it's an interesting question because I think in many cases, the method by which the search happens is actually not terribly relevant to the defense. That is, it doesn't go to the person's guilt or innocence. It's not creating evidence that's sitting on his computer. And so in many ways, it's kind of like asking, what is the brand of the sledgehammer that has been used to knock down his front door? The important question is, was a sledgehammer used? Yes. Did it knock down his front door? Yes. That's going to be debated. Was that proper? Was it reasonable? All those kind of questions. But does it really matter the intimate details of how that entry was made? And so that's, I think, going to be one of the interesting questions that the courts are going to wrestle with as this goes ahead is, does this actually materially help the defense in some way? Or is the government's need to have, under established doctrines, secrecy about particular tools and techniques, is that going to be outweigh the defendant's demands for disclosure? There were more here, but maybe I'll stop there and we can come back to some of the others as well.
Hey, Amy, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I think this brings up an interesting point because we're talking now about disclosing to the defense the vulnerability used. But if you pull that out a little bit, one of the major issues is if you're disclosing to the provider, to the person in control of the software, the vulnerability that's been used. Because it's, the sledgehammer in the front door example, it's this, if they have a sledgehammer that can knock down a front door and 50 million people have that same front door and use it every single day, should you tell the front door manufacturer, if there's a key that can open the front door, I guess is a better example, and that same key can open all of them, and if somebody else finds that key, they can open all of them as well. Should all of the other innocent people using that front door not know that they have a vulnerability in their front door that needs to be fixed? Or should the person who makes the front door be able to fix that? There is a process in government for this. It was reinvigorated is the term that was used after the Heartbleed bug was discovered, because there was a lot of speculation that the NSA may have known about the Heartbleed bug and not disclosed it because they were taking advantage of it for intelligence matters. And so the White House started this process again. It's called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process. It is unclear to the extent it is being used for all of the bugs that are out there. They say it's being used, but we know, for example, that the bug used in the Apple case in San Bernardino was not put through this process because they never took possession of it. It's supposed to cover every time the government discovers or comes into possession of a vulnerability, but this one kind of was like a black box and they never had it, so they don't put that through the process. And it's also not codified. And so the first panel was talking about a lot of the uncertainty of the policies that are in place right now as opposed to the laws and whether or not they will continue into the next administration. So in addition to the fact that it's unclear how often it's used, we also don't know the fate of it come January if that process will continue to operate.
Right, you raised, go ahead.
So I just want to point out we've sort of conflated two issues here when we talked about disclosure. The first is disclosure of, when we use the sledgehammer analogy, that might be a nice simplifying analogy, but unfortunately it glosses over one of the important parts, which is that we don't know that it's actually only a sledgehammer. We know that it's being used with the intention of using it as a specific kind of tool, but we don't know what else it does. And the only way we have any chance of being sure of what its behavior is, and even there, this is imperfect, is sort of relentless scrutiny and examination. So the first problem is we're not actually sure it's only a sledgehammer.
Matt, can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
And so, but the interest in knowing whether or not it's just a sledgehammer or if it's greater is for greater cybersecurity for the public, right?
Well,
not for the defendants.
Well, that part might be relevant both to the public and the defendant, right? So it's relevant to the defendant because, the question of did this expose more data? Did it actually only limit the search to what was specified in the warrant? You can really only know that by looking at the tool itself. We can also only know if there might have been other damage done to the computer that perhaps didn't result in this going to the government, but might have exposed information or damaged the computer in some other way. The only way we can know that is to examine the tool in the context that it was actually used, preferably by an adversarial process that's given sufficient resources to look. And even there, that's imperfect. The second problem, and this is the much broader public problem, is that these tools generally involve exploiting vulnerabilities that could be used not just by the government for lawful warrants and lawful searches, but also by criminals and by foreign hostile nation states and so on.
Are we generally talking about 0 days here?
Sometimes they're 0 days, but they don't need to be. In fact, probably 0 days are the most prominent. That is, those are vulnerabilities that no one actually knows about that have been discovered for the first time by the people who built the specific tool. But there also might be vulnerabilities that are known and that are just being applied to this tool because they haven't been patched yet. The lifetime of vulnerabilities tends to have a fairly long tail before they're patched, even after they've been disclosed. If there's a tool that the government is using based on a flaw that isn't known to the vendor or wasn't known to the vendor to be exploitable remotely, there is a risk that someone else will discover the same flaw and use it for very bad purposes, potentially against the government itself. We don't really know very much about how often that happens because these tools are shrouded in so much secrecy.
So that's one area where greater transparency, I think, is essential.
That's right, and this is an example of something that requires both very subtle technical and very subtle policy judgment that really can only be achieved by more transparency than we've got.
Should that be a policy change or a legislative change, do you think, guys?
So, I mean, speaking generally, we want Congress to regulate this activity, including enforcing a level of transparency, at the very least similar to what we have in the wiretapping statute, which also would include, for that matter, actual data about how often this is done and how many people it impacts, which right now we have no freaking clue.
Richard, would you be opposed to such requirements?
So we're in obviously a transitional period in the government, so I can't begin to predict what the next administration would do. What I can say is that I would encourage you to take a look at the a blog post from Michael Daniels, who's the White House cybersecurity advisor from a couple years ago. And what he says is that basically lays out, I think, a pretty solid argument that everyone across the country, including the government, relies on computer networks. Disclosing vulnerabilities is usually going to make sense because that's going to provide protection and security for everyone. However, there are legitimate trade-offs, and so there are going to be certain circumstances where there is a need for this tool, this undisclosed vulnerability, in order to solve some crucial intelligence problem. And you can just imagine all of the kinds of things that come into that category, also public safety, so terrorist attacks or theft of our trade secrets or child sexual assault. And so building a stockpile of vulnerabilities that's going to harm our general security is not a good policy decision. But that's not the same thing as saying that we should never do it. And therefore, that's why we have the Vulnerability Equities Process, or VEP. And it doesn't create any hard or fast rules, but it does lay out the kind of criteria that are going to be considered and, frankly, make sure that those are the kinds of considerations. So how significant is the risk? Does it affect our critical infrastructures? Is it patchable? Is it likely to be discovered by someone else? What is the intelligence loss that's going to occur if we release it and it becomes patched and then unavailable? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that the VEP would ask. And I think that's a pretty good set of questions that you would want the executive branch to be making these decisions and trying to weigh and doing it in an appropriate and robust way.
Do you at DOJ or the FBI submit all the vulnerabilities that you use in your exploits through, for the nits to this VEP, to this process?
So I've now exhausted the scope of how far I can go. I'm clear about what has been made public, but beyond that, I'm not at this point entitled to talk further about what's going on in the behind the scenes.
Well, no one will know.
Yeah, well, this process itself, as you mentioned, is newly invigorated. It came about also as one of the post-Snowden transparency reforms. Do you think that this is another is something that ought to be codified, put in statute?
Sure.
How would you strengthen it, if so?
I mean, I think that's exactly the kind of conversation we want to have, including hearings, which we haven't had. I don't want to jump in front and say, this is how you would necessarily draft a VEP statute, because we still don't have a great deal of information about it. We appreciate the transparency that the Obama administration has engaged in to tell us about it and give us some vague idea of the criteria they're using, but we don't really know who sits at the table, how often they meet, the number of vulns that have gone through the process. They've thrown around a vague number of 90+% ultimately get disclosed, but like out of how many, how long were those held on to before they were disclosed? Were they exploited before they were disclosed? Questions of that nature. We really don't have any of that kind of information. And so I think the first step here in deciding how to codify this process, I think some kind of version of this should be in law to protect us. I think the first step would be actually having hearings about it and having an engaged Congress working on it and looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also point out that this is an example where the devil is entirely in the details. You know, we can all agree on very high-level principles that kind of no one would disagree with, that, there will be these cases on one end of the spectrum, and there'll be cases on the other end of the spectrum. And, that's almost none of the cases, right? There's this large middle ground, and making sensible judgments about that middle ground is going to require enormous both technical and policy expertise. So this is a non-trivial task that this, that whoever the arbiters on the vulnerability equities process are, they have to be both technical and policy experts with access to a very deep set of detail about what's going on, and this is not something that can simply be a few people who meet every quarter.
And to bring it almost back to where we started, now that Congress has allowed the Rule 41 changes to go into effect by not acting to stop them, and there are several measures introduced to postpone those changes, just to give them time to address what they should do in light of government hacking. And I believe Senator Cornyn is the one who blocked all of those postponements from going into effect. Now they're going to enter 2017, and this really should be at the top of their agenda. All of the issues we've talked about here, the vulnerabilities equities process, a potential Title III or rules for warrants for government hacking, what transparency measures need to be in place. Congress has really kind of put it on themselves, the onus back on themselves, that they need to be considering this first and foremost as we enter into the new year. Because this activity now, they've basically implicitly blessed. They've allowed this argument that by not acting, they've said that this is okay. And I'm not sure a lot of them would agree with that, but that's going to be the argument in court now.
Matt, you talked about the need for judges to also have greater technical expertise or understanding of the issues that they're ruling on, and also the participants in the VEP to also have that. So do you think that is there a need for, say, a special technical judicial advocate in the courts, and then another special technical expert on the VEP? What do you think?
Well, so I mean, I think I wouldn't say how to actually structure it, but I would say that almost all parts of this require a significant infusion of technical expertise at almost every level that's not currently there routinely. And certainly, in the case of a judge who's being asked to sign a warrant that isn't fully understood, there is room for judges to ask questions. There's room, to do things like appoint special masters. There are. I can imagine mechanisms for doing this, but and I'm not going to be too prescriptive about what we should do, except to say that we really urgently need to do quite a bit, or this could have far-reaching unintended consequences.
I'll just add, I'm curious judges have a bunch of young people working for them every year to 2 years, these law clerks. It'd be great if they started favoring hiring young law students who also have a tech background, or going ahead and hiring some non-lawyers to, who serve as clerks simply to assist with technical cases. I think that might be one of the easiest injection points of tech expertise into the the bench.
Yeah, and some law schools are actually starting to set up some joint programs with cybersecurity and computer science departments and law. So I think they're trying to move in that direction.
Including at Penn.
Right.
I would agree absolutely to the idea that there should be a greater technical understanding in our court system. I would moderate that, though, a little bit by saying, except that the courts, this is not a new problem for them. They've been dealing with technical issues extensively, and we've got patent suits. We have all sorts of other kinds of suits in the courts that require technical understandings. So I don't want my experience with federal judges is that they are not shrinking violets, and when they don't understand something, they're going to ask questions and they're going to get to the bottom of things. I don't want to undersell the idea that that the courts actually are pretty good at figuring out difficult questions or getting the special masters or resources or briefing or whatever it is, testimony, to get to the point where they can make good decisions on these things. I guess let me just respond to the Congress should act immediately question. I guess the alternative to at least acting with respect to whether we need new rules for remote searches is to say, well, we have a bunch of safeguards and greater clarity that's going to be coming. Maybe we should wait and see whether there are, the court system is able to deal with these questions, and whether there are any abuses that come to light, and that sort of question. I think we are going to see a lot of activity, as I mentioned, on these cases that are coming up. And of course, from the department's perspective, we are committed to being good partners in figuring these things out and being clear about what we're doing when we are using these tools and under Rule 41 and going to the courts and doing those things. So I think it's an interesting question, but definitely one that will be interesting to see what the next Congress and next administration wants to do with it.
Just in terms of unintended consequences, I think there have been instances or cases where the law enforcement agency, in fact, in 2013, I think the FBI obtained something like 300 individualized warrants to target specific users of an anonymized or anonymous email service called Tormail. And the idea there was to infect the computers of just these users and not all the other innocent users of Tormail. But according to some press reports, apparently the way in which the FBI deployed this software ended up infecting everybody who just logged into the actual Tormail homepage. So it seems that even though that may not have been the intended, consequence, it did, end up infecting completely innocent people. So, I mean, I guess, Richard, does it mean sometimes there are unintended consequences, right, that arise in your cases?
I can't
without
speak
commenting
to this
on the specific
particular case,
but in general.
But as I said before, no activity in human life is completely free of all chance of error or whatever. Although I would dispute the point that there's been some systemic problem or some greater issue that's gone on. I think we've actually done a pretty good job so far in making sure that the tools are acting in the way that they are. And if you think about a situation where a particularized offender is using a particularized email account and you set up this remote search to affect only that person, that's actually a pretty targeted search and not an overbroad or overweening kind of situation.
And have you known that approach to actually work, to to target that. And you've used individualized warrants to target them, and that has worked.
Absolutely, yes. There are situations where that's, I think, going to probably be the more common case, not this idea of the mass search or this mass activity, which has attracted a lot of the interest. But if you've got an individual who's, let's say, threatening to kill a government official, and you have a pretty good reason to believe that it's real, and you have very short time deadline to try and figure out who the individual is, you can imagine law enforcement is going to be trying to find a way to identify that individual, and it's going to be targeted and specific because you have that probable cause to do that. Obviously, these are going to be case by case, and they, as I said, have to be particular, and they have to have probable cause, they have to be evaluated by judges, and all those built-in safeguards are going to be true. And if we mess it up, then we can get sued. And if it's overbroad, then the defendant can bring a suppression motion, and these things will get worked out in the courts. And so I really think we do have a strong court system and a strong system that can be and will be applied to these Rule 41 warrant situations, the same as it has for the last 200 years.
I mean, I'm curious, and maybe you can't say this, but were all of those people notified that they were searched such that they could challenge the fact that they'd had their communications intercepted?
So that's another value of the Rule 41 process, is that indeed it requires that the person be notified. Of course, it doesn't require completely and endlessly exhaustive efforts. It requires reasonable efforts. You've got to do your very best, and it may vary, and it will probably have to be run by the judge before decisions are made. But yes, in the cases, for example, where the people are using a child pornography website to exchange images, most often that's going to be followed up with a search of the person's residence to obtain the evidence from their home that's going to be used in the trial to come. They're obviously going to be notified. Rule 41 requires this. This is part of the transparency. What you don't want is to have this stuff being done outside of the court system, or not with the review of the judges, and not within the transparent and protective process that we have developed in the courts.
Okay.
So I just one quick reaction. You mentioned that you think that you're doing a pretty good job of making these tools robust and secure, and I believe that that's true. But I just want to point out, Microsoft and Apple and Linux and Android and Adobe and so on are also doing pretty good jobs of securing platforms, and we are in a terrible cybersecurity mess, right? The pretty good job that is being done is unfortunately still not so great. Software is hard, and I think it's really a mistake to get too overconfident that these terribly imperfect software development processes are always going to work the way we want them to.
I'm not suggesting that we should be overconfident. I think we should be very careful, and as I mentioned before, we do look carefully and test and validate our tools before we use them. But I think it's a slightly different question on whether you can create a truly secure piece of software that will not let anyone in. Obviously, as you say, that's a big problem. We've got hackers that are able to break in all the time. And isn't the government's activity pretty similar to the hacker side of this equation? You don't need to be able to secure the whole system in a perfect way. You just need to use one particularized vulnerability that will get the narrow piece of information that you need in order to proceed with the case.
Kevin.
So, I just wanted to flag this Tormail example. This was basically a bunch of people who I would say suffered a Fourth Amendment level search or seizure of their data. Ironically, because they were using a service to protect their privacy, but basically this impacted everyone who was using the service at the time. That may have been an unintended consequence, which is worrisome, especially when you think of the other scenarios where unintentional consequences might impact hundreds or thousands of people. There's also a perhaps even more worrisome possibility that the DOJ, after getting those 300 individualized warrants, decided, we think how we are technically implementing this is the best and most reasonable way to do it, and we will incidentally be impacting these people, but we'll minimize out that data. And based on, likely some some legal memo in the computer crime and intellectual property section of the DOJ that has never been in a brief in front of a court, that has not been tested. And that goes back to my theme of this curious and worrisome ratcheting up of the authority based on sometimes extreme legal theories that haven't been put to any test and may not be put to any test unless and until actually someone moves to suppress in a criminal case.
The reason I don't think that actually makes sense is that my understanding is by depositing the malware on the Tormail homepage, the government was now unable to actually identify the IP addresses of the individuals, the 300 individuals that they wanted. So it basically made that whole effort pointless, which to me doesn't make any sense. Why would you?
It'd be a good question for them to answer, and yet because they don't want to talk about any of these details or release them to the defendants, it's kind of hard to even have the conversation.
So I got to respond to that. Look, I'm not answering because I don't want to tell the public about this. Right. It's an ongoing case. There's continuing investigations. We have a firm and reasonable policy that we can't talk about cases that are going on for fear that we're going to jeopardize the investigation or all the other things that are going on. And
I'm not indicating malintent. I'm just pointing out the policy problem that raises when we can't actually discuss.
And yet, they will be notified because Rule 41 requires it, right? And I would say these are all speculations by
all the innocent
news
users,
reporting of people who are dreaming up ideas about what might have happened.
All the innocent users will be notified as well, those who've had their
so it requires you to
computers.
notify the people, the owners of the property that were searched.
Well, it does now.
What's that?
It does now, right? I mean, are you talking about the amendments to Rule 41 or?
So the amendments require reasonable efforts in certain circumstances, yes. But reasonable efforts is not no efforts or no thing. If we are able to identify the individual, then that person will get notice. I suppose it's possible that you might not, if the tool didn't work, for example, we didn't actually do any searching. No, we're not going to notify anybody because the search didn't happen. I mean, there's all sorts of permutations here, but in any case, Rule 41 takes this into account and requires the kinds of notice that are reasonable, and people will get notice if their property was searched. In a physical world analogy, if, as rarely happens, but does happen, the police get it wrong and they've searched the wrong house. They're across the street from the search scene where they thought they were going to be. Does the person whose house the search gets noticed? Of course, yes, that house was searched and therefore they will get notices of the search, even though it was unintended or mistaken.
I'd like to switch over for a minute now to the to encryption and locked devices, and I think Matt raised something that you said you've advocated, I think, along with Susan Landau, which is one alternative to, say, decryption mandate to mandate, exceptional access or backdoors into devices is to allow the government with a warrant to essentially hack the endpoint or create an exploit that will allow them to remotely access the locked phone. Tell us why you think that's a good idea, and then I'd like to get your responses to that.
Sure. So I think we've been hearing a lot about the going dark problem, and the solution, or certainly a centerpiece of the solutions that have been offered by the government have involved some sort of built-in backdoors or key escrow or design mandates to allow for lawful access. And that, unfortunately, is likely to make our currently horribly weak and fragile infrastructure much weaker and much more fragile, discourage the use of tools like cryptography, discourage the use of good security practices, and create centralized points of failure where none currently exists or need to exist. So I think there are compelling reasons to very strongly oppose any kinds of design mandates of the kind that are being advocated for. That said, as we can see by the expansion of Rule 41, in many, and I would argue the majority of cases, search of the endpoints by exploitation of vulnerabilities and so forth is a viable alternative to that. And we're seeing it done. It's happening. The legal rules for that are unclear. The Rule 41 change is the first sort of codified place where we're seeing it addressed, and I think it really does need to be addressed by Congress. But I think it's simply the case that this has been done for a while. It's going to scale up, and we need to confront in law and in policy what the rules for that going forward are going to be as it scales up.
Kevin, go ahead. I'll follow.
Excuse me. I don't think there are a lot of people in the privacy and civil liberties community who are fans of government hacking, who want to say, go government hacking. But we also, I mean, if there is going to be a continuing increase in the deployment of strong encryption tools, which we're a fan of, and there is not some sort of mandate that that data be accessible by the government, which we are not a fan of, there will be more government hacking whether we like it or not. And the question is, what are the rules for that activity? I just want to flag a big concern that sort of brings together both of these issues and highlights the need for, I think, amongst others, congressional action, which is how they might implement that government hacking in a way that would basically be a backdoor and hurt all of our digital health. And that is subverting the software update systems through which we receive all of our security updates from the companies. This is an idea that is occasionally tossed around as a potential way to deliver malware to access encrypted data. And I think it would be an incredibly dangerous thing, and yet I also think that our current technical assistance provisions around surveillance could be read potentially by a court to allow this sort of thing. Why is this a bad idea? Because we are basically in a digital public health crisis. We are facing many grave ills. The medicine that we get for that, the vaccines that we receive, come through these secure update channels from the companies. If and when it becomes public that the government has subverted that trusted channel to actually decrease our privacy and security, you will have a lot more people avoiding those updates. And it's sort of like people who aren't vaccinating against diseases. By their making that choice, they are making us all less safe because they become hosts for the thing that might infect us. And so I just wanted to put a strong stake in the ground to flag this is a huge risk, and it's something, it's a path we definitely don't want to take. For what it's worth, our host, Julian, has written about this point, as well as Chris Segoyan and several others. But I think it's important.
And I just want to pull it back to the international perspective on this a little bit, because we have to remember that the internet does not stop at the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans on either side of the United States, and it actually is used globally. And so both from the going dark perspective, the US's rhetoric around whether or not we are going to undermine encryption or whether or not that's acceptable has provided a lot of wiggle room for other countries to pass laws or implement policies that actually do undermine encryption, either give them authority to outlaw end-to-end encryption from being used by companies. In some cases, there are laws now that require end users to install backdoors on all of their devices within specific countries. And so there's that element, while at the same time we are talking about government hacking without having rules for it. And so we're seeing other countries also pick up on that. And in the UK, for example, we just had a law receive royal assent, the Investigatory Powers Bill, that formalizes UK government hacking authority that might allow the UK government from a objective read to do exactly what Kevin was just saying, which is try to force companies to implement backdoors and security updates. And so by not acting in a out-front way to protect privacy in law affirmatively, we're not only allowing these conversations to kind of wither and die in the US, but we're allowing great room for security to be lowered across the board outside of the country. And those effects are going to be felt in the United States without question.
Richard, did you want to weigh in on that? I know you're also very concerned about the international climate.
Certainly, speaking to the international question, this idea that that U.S. policy, which I think has been pretty equivocal on this subject, is the main motivator that's letting other countries do things that some of us may not like, I think is missing the mark. Other countries face the very same public security and national security problems we do, and I suspect they are going to try to address those problems as best they can and within their own political systems, regardless of our positions on these things, but certainly regardless of the middle road that we seem to have taken over the last few years. Let me address just a couple of other things. I think as far as is this a solution to the going dark problem, I think the comments that have been made so far, I think it is a sort of inevitably going to be part of what the government will end up doing. And certainly when there is an opportunity, like in the San Bernardino case, where a tool becomes available that can be used to execute a warrant, it's going to be used. I think, though, we should also be clear that it is by no means a 100% solution to that problem, and for a couple of different reasons. Investigations, at least on the law enforcement side, need to be targeted and timely and calculated to produce admissible evidence, and each of those three things can have some difficulties. Targeted, if you've got a particular offender that you believe may be committing some serious crime, it can't be a perfect solution if you are lucky enough to have that person be using an operating system that happens to have a vulnerability that you happen to have a tool that will address. It's going to be a catch-as-catch-can situation at best. Also, it's timely. Is that tool available now, or do we have to wait a long time, as in months and months from the San Bernardino case? Or frankly, in the case of hackers trying to break into something, they generally do it over a period of time and often spend a lot of energy doing that. That may not be acceptable in the context of law enforcement investigations. And then the admissible evidence question that I've dealt with a little bit already. Let me offer one other counterpoint here. Matt said the common thing that we've heard from a number of places about how creating a mandate or a backdoor solution or whatever words you want to use for that would have grievous security harm to the average person and the users. I would encourage us to ask for the evidence on that, to sort of probe this question a little bit further. Because if you look at the way that companies and agencies and individuals behave, these end-to-end solutions, or these solutions that don't allow there to be any interference in the middle, are not the norm. And if you look at, for example, the Department of Justice, which is extremely concerned about our security, there is an app that sits in the background on my phone that lets the government have access to the device when it's needed. And yet, that is exactly what the problem was in the San Bernardino case with the iOS. Similarly, if you talk to network defenders, they're actually pretty worried about end-to-end encryption, because when you have phishing schemes that are going after access to their networks, it's much harder to intercept those things and block them at the gateway if the communication is encrypted end-to-end and unavailable to the individuals. And then you would have to ask questions like, why is it that Gmail, which doesn't use that kind of encryption that makes it inaccessible to the provider, why is that not a backdoor, if that's the question that the way that you want to characterize these things? And why are we not saying to Gmail, how dare you access your customers' emails in order to sell advertising to them? Or put another way, if we're okay with Gmail doing that, why are we not okay with having the public security benefits of it? Aren't those just as important as the ability to sell advertising to customers? So I would encourage you to ask this question in a little more deeply way. What is the security benefit here? And is that security benefit, in fact, worth it when it comes to the public safety harm that is resulting from the end-to-end encryption by default. And now I'll turn it over to the wolves over here to attack.
I was about to offer an olive branch,
real
but
We'd like to leave a little time for questions.
I mean, then
oh, no time.
Yeah, we want. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I find it shocking in an age where we are seeing a former Secretary of State, a major political party, hacked. Sony hacked, their emails spilling out everywhere, all these nude photos coming out of iCloud. That it's hard to recognize what the security value of using a more secure option is. I think we should be. I think there are a lot of people, especially in politics in Hollywood right now, that are starting to use email less because it is riskier. No one's saying Gmail's super insecure, but it is certainly less secure than an end-to-end solution. And we actually need to be promoting the spread of that technology rather than trying to dampen it, considering just how dire our cybersecurity situation is.
Counterpoint, how were those computers hacked? Was it through phishing? Because if it was, that's going to be worse in a situation where end-to-end encryption becomes the norm.
Okay, great. We could go another hour if we stayed on this topic.
Yes, we could.
Let's open this up to questions. We're going to bring the microphones around. Please identify yourself and ask your question in the form of a question. Thank you. This woman right here? Yep.
Hi, Carrie Dever, the Center for Copyright Integrity. I went online to research something because I thought for a second from what was being bandied about out there that I forgot a fact. Tor was created by the government, by a naval employee, Paul Syverson, who gets royalties every time it's used. ICANN was released by the government under the Clinton administration. All of these domain names that everybody is using for uploading nude photos which they shouldn't take anyhow, and for ISIS is all done through the ICANN out of California, which went September to Switzerland. Let's remember where this all started.
So what is your question, ma'am? Sorry?
My question is, why aren't you talking about the correct origins of ICANN and Tor? These dark things did not just pop out. Government employees and academics had access to them. Emails actually exchanged in the RFCs that said maybe we shouldn't be using this stuff.
I mean, I'll just briefly respond. I'm not sure how ICANN is relevant, but in terms of Tor, yes, it was developed by Naval Research. It is open source software. I don't believe anyone receives a royalty when it's used, but it's important to understand its origin was, one, to protect our own spies. They need secrecy too, and also was heavily funded later by the state, our own State Department, to help defend human rights outside of the U.S., the rights of dissidents and others. And all I would say is, if it's good for them, it's good for us too. Like, if the U.S. Supports people outside of the United States having these tools, they should support people inside the United States having these tools.
Yeah, and I should just interject. I should say I chair the board of directors of the Tor project, and I assure you there are no, if there are royalties, there are no royalties. It's all free software and so on. I should also point out that one of the reasons that Tor is open to everybody to use is that it's simply not possible to protect our own spies and our own government employees who are using it without the cover of the general public using it, right? Anonymity and privacy loves company in that sense. And that's simply part of how the technology has to work.
If I could just add one quick thing. I think there are people, though, out there who are asking the question of, has it outlived the value? Is the benefit worth the cost? And as I mentioned, the investigation of sites where there's absolute rampant criminal activity going on, I think it's a fair question to ask, how does that balance work today?
Okay. There's a woman in the green sweater in the back, please.
Jimena Musa with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I think that
Can you speak more directly into the mic?
I cannot hear a word you're saying.
Is it on? Is this better? Okay.
Yes.
Jimena Musa with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I just think there's been a huge missing piece of this conversation when we talk about the process and the notice and how it works, and that this is based fundamentally in the state's ability to incarcerate someone, to deprive them of their liberty. So when it comes a question of notice of the techniques used, I think the government often has these sort of blanket comparisons, like it's a sledgehammer, as if it's one uniform thing that only operates one way. So I think I want to get to the point that when you talk about using these techniques to break into computers to investigate people and prosecute them and potentially deprive them of their liberty, it is extremely important that notice is there. I think the government knows full well that there are many ways in which that can be done, in camera, not in open court, not in a way that releases the information to everyone, but gives the defense an opportunity to examine how a computer was broken into, searched, what were the parameters, what might have operated differently. And so I would like someone to address the piece of, or to differentiate the piece between what a traditional search warrant does, the ability to challenge it, which frankly is quite limited, the suppression remedies often don't come through, and how this technology being used changes that considerably. It is not a place where you can go and look and say, they searched my home, they hit these 3 places, because I can tell or I was there. And so I would love someone to address that, particularly from the technology piece, but also from the rights of the accused in a criminal case, who do have the right to confront the evidence against them.
So I think I touched on this briefly before, but I agree that the courts have a lot of tools that are useful here in trying to sort out these questions, and they're going to do that in due course. There is, however, a long-standing rule for decades and decades that there are certain times when there is a technology or something that has particular investigative value that will lose its investigative value if it is disclosed broadly. So take, for example, how a particular recording device is shaped. It is, of course, useful to the future mobsters to know how we are concealing our recording devices. It's generally not that useful to the defense to know what the exact shape of the device or the color or the size or the battery life or whatever it is. That there was a recording, of course, is critical. That the recording happened in a certain way is, of course, critical. Turning over all of the relevant stuff to the defendant makes sense. But whether it's useful to know the exact shape of the device, not so much. And so courts have traditionally tried to balance these kinds of questions. And I expect that's the kind of debate that will happen as we go forward with this. If there is a situation where the code is indeed needed in order for the defendant to be able to evaluate what the scope of the search was, then yes, then that's probably something that would have to be turned over, or at least turned over in camera with a protective order to the defense. But if it doesn't have any materiality or relevance, what we really need to know is what was searched, how much was searched, when it was searched, what was the scope, and those questions can be answered through other means. Then I think courts are likely to look at that and say, we're going to use the traditional rules and say this piece, this technical specification doesn't need to be disclosed.
Thank you.
So let me just interject one quick point to that. The lifetime of these tools is much, much shorter than the lifetime of a recording device. So it's entirely possible, particularly as this scales up, that on the time frame of a criminal prosecution, by the time that disclosure would take place, those tools are well on their way to being obsolete.
It's a fair point.
We have time
Yeah,
for one
absolutely.
more? All right. Well,
I want to leave
time for lunch.
to have a bite of lunch. But if you'll join us upstairs, we'll have lunch from noon to about 1:10. I think C-SPAN cuts away here, but if those watching at home would like to see the lunch keynote by civil rights legend Wade Henderson, you can catch our live stream at cato.org. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.
This was fun.